I'm Pat Garland Stewart, and welcome back to the Goat Keeping School. Today we're going to be talking about housing. And again, it's housing for Nigerian dwarf goats. So, how big does it have to be? How small can you get away with? And please think about the fact that the goats keep growing until they're 3 or 4 years old. So, unless you want to make a new house every year, which maybe somebody does, I don't have the time to do that. Don't worry about them in the wintertime being able to fill up a space to stay warm. You can always bed down deeper and let them or add another goat. But people tend to get them as little babies because they're so cute and forget that they're going to grow for the next couple of years. Most of the growth is going to happen in the first year, but they're going to get a little taller on year 1 and 2, 3, and definitely wider up until age 4. So try to make your plans accordingly. That being said, you don't need a barn as big as mine. My barn was built before my house was built. In trying to build the house, we ran into some trouble. So instead of losing the contractors in the middle of a very busy construction season, we had them build the barn. If I were doing it again, I would not do it the way I did it. I was kind of at the mercy of a very generous family member, but I also never really put my foot down to say, I need to be able to think this through. So take the time to think it through. So what do you need for a house? You can get away with something as small as a doghouse. My goats use a little igloo for the first year or two. I would get a bigger igloo if I was going to have a mama with babies in a space. And personally, I wouldn't do that. But for some people, that may work for you. My problem with igloos is they're great in the winter, but they're really hot in the summer. So you need to make sure that whatever you've got for housing allows for movement of air, for circulation. So the primary goals with a goat shed is to keep them out of the rain and keep them out of the wind. Those are the two main things. Now, that doesn't mean give them a totally airtight, thermally insulated, little heated bungalow. They don't need that. And in fact, I don't recommend having them in the house. Now, a lot of people may want to turn off the phone, the telephone right now. A lot of people may want to shut the camera off right now, but they're not pets. Not in my way of thinking. They can live in your house, but if you bring them in the house, don't ask them to go back outside in the winter because their body is going to adjust to the heat of your house and not be able to compensate quickly enough when they go outside. So think about that and think about trying to keep them warm and dry without overheating or stifling their air circulation. Does that sound like I just contradicted myself? Not really. This is a picture of my kid sheds that I use for my wethers. I use large dog houses for my baby does and some yearlings. They don't need anything fancy. If you buy a little wood shed, that's enough. Reuse an old chicken coop, that's great. If you're going to go with a Rubbermaid shed, drill holes near the top. If you can avoid making it out of plastic, do. If you do have to make it out of plastic, make sure that there's air circulation up near the roof. Goats put out a lot of heat. People underestimate how much heat they put out. I live in extreme northern Massachusetts. Read that, may as well be in New Hampshire. We have gotten down to 25 to 30 below zero here. Thankfully, not for long bits of time. We have had 10 feet of snow on the ground at one time. My goats live in some pretty extreme temperatures. We also can, in the summertime, get up to 100 degrees. Thankfully, that's very rare. But muggy and in the 90s, that's not that rare. So my goats have to have one house that will suit them all winter long and all summer long. So our biggest problems tend to not be those extreme seasons, but mud season in the spring. That's our biggest quandary, is how do we deal with the moisture? But when planning a house, one of the simplest things to do is either get a doghouse or build a little lean-to shed. 3-sided is usually enough. Mine are 3.5 sided. There's a little door for them. Put it up on top of a pallet, and then put a board on top of the pallet. So you don't want them to step on any nails on the pallet. You don't want them to break a leg getting caught between the wood and a pallet. But you don't want them right on the hard ground if you can avoid it. If you can't avoid it, that's fine. They'll adjust. But with that piece of wood on top of that pallet, then you can pile shavings or pile straw on top. I don't recommend sawdust because they'll inhale it. They will eat the sawdust. They will eat the shavings. That's not going to hurt them. But it's not great for them either. So if they eat the straw, it's no big deal. There's like no nutritional value to straw whatsoever. There's no sugars left to bother their bellies. But you do need to give them some way to hold the heat and buffer themselves from the cold and the wet. So you got to keep them dry, and you got to keep them out of the draft. That doesn't mean insulate their sheds. Please don't insulate. Every situation I've ever heard of a whole herd getting pneumonia, it's because they lived in an insulated shed, an insulated barn. We want to keep them warm, but because they crank out so much heat and they crank out so much moisture, that burping is constantly bringing up moisture, constantly bringing out heat. That's going to condense on the ceiling and fall down on them, and they're going to wind up breathing moist air and wind up with pneumonia. We don't want that. We want the air to move, just not directly on them. So if you look at my barn, you can see between the pieces of wood slat. When my father came and looked at the barn for the first time, because he's from the Midwest, he said, "Why didn't you just put them in a hay rick?" Because there was so much air coming through. What he didn't know is, if he looked carefully, because he was looking up, if he looked at 4 feet and below, you could not see through between the boards. That's because on the inside of our regular barn wood, we have a plywood layer. So the air can move into the plywood, and that has to go up over to keep moving. And that up and over is over the tops of the goats. So the goats don't get snowed on, the goats don't get rained on, and the goats don't get blown directly at. Unless it's a storm, in which case we close the door. And then they don't have that problem. Our door does not have those gaps. It's actually shiplap wood. So, those are the main concerns with building a house. It's not rocket science. It isn't high tech. You can use all sorts of different designs. You can reuse doll houses for little playhouses for kids. The goats love as long as they're dry and warm. Okay? Now, how often do you clean it? That's another problem. Some people want to clean out every day, and if you've got 1 or 2, that's not a problem. It can get expensive, though. So what I recommend is that you try to clean it out once a week. The little goat pellets are so small that they'll go right between the tines of a rake. But if you let it pack up and you get a little bit of a week-long pack, the straw, the hay, whatever you're using for bedding will catch the manure, and you'll be able to clean it out faster. Rake it out and then sweep it out. And then a little bit of lime will cut down on the ammonia buildup from their urine. And it will also help buffer any acidity in the straw so that when you go to clean it up the next week, you're actually adding sweet manure that's been adjusted for acid, and it makes it more palatable for your gardens. Okay? Now, right now, you may be able to hear the sound of the tractor going by from up here in the attic studios. We're doing a deep pack clean out today. It's many months worth of clean out in the barn. More than I would like to have had done, but my husband works off farm. We also have a soap business. I'm disabled, so I really can't do it very easily. So we use the tractor, and every couple months we pull all the walls down and we go right in. We happen to have a 20-foot by 20-foot barn and a subcompact tractor, so that works well. If you've got a skid steer loader or a bobcat, you can do the same type of thing. But I've also got 30 goats in that barn. I don't have one or two. When I had my 2 goats and 2 sheep, I raked the stall out once a week. That was ample. But with the way we are now, as size we are, it's just not practical to do that. Once we get this pat clean, we're getting ready to redo the barn, and I will do it in the way that I recommend, which is if you are going to have these animals for a while, they're not just pets, they're not just things that you're planning on getting rid of, which I hope you're not, but invest in putting down a concrete pad and then get rubber mats on top of them, horse stall mats. The direct contact concrete will be hard on the goat's legs, but if you put rubber mats on top, that's a cushion that they can handle. It's also an insulation layer from the cold concrete, but it also makes it much easier to keep the stall clean. You can actually sweep it out and then hose it down. We, until this point for 20 years, have been using a dirt floor. That's fine too, but when you're doing a dairy goat, you need to be able to get things really clean. And I'm not as satisfied that we're keeping this clean as we should. So we are working our way towards that concrete pad, but it's going to be a little while. So meanwhile, the goats are on hard ground and they're fine with that. I don't recommend putting them on sand unless you've got some stone dirt. Stone dust is fine. Putting them direct on ground is fine, but the sand, it will wick away the moisture faster, but it'll make it much harder to clean up. So just dirt pack is a good way to go. Now, the biggest problems we have are making sure that they don't foul their water bucket. Unfortunately, for them to be able to drink, it usually needs to be at a position that's also right at the level of their anus. So one goat backs up to it, dumps a load into the water bucket, and then they won't drink it. Goats are really fussy about their water, and you should plan on checking the water or changing the water a couple times a day. In the wintertime, it's good to change it out with hot water. I'm not saying scalding water, but 50 to 100 degree water is their favorite temperature if you want to make them happy. Again, at the scale that I'm operating, I can't heat that up, but we do use heated water buckets, which keep it at 50 degrees, keep it from thawing, and they'll drink that just fine. If I've got a new mama, I'll give her some steamy warm water. She's very happy with that. You need to keep their water bucket up, either hung on a wall or set on a step, so they actually have to take a bit of a step up to get to the water. That will keep the manure out of the bucket more, or hanging it up. But remember, you've got to consider the size of your goats. Are they babies? They can't step up and over as much. They're also not as likely to follow the bucket as an adult is. So keep that in mind and keep the water clean. Adding a little bit of apple cider vinegar will help cut down on summer algae. It will also help acidify the urine to keep them healthier. The other thing is their food. In a pinch, you can throw it on the ground. They don't like it on the ground. My goats deal with that. I have had mangers. I now have a successful manger set up, but in the past, we've had to put it on the ground. That yields all sorts of problems that you have to be ready for if you're going to do that. It's much better to just put up a simple manger. Just take a piece of livestock panel or a piece of woven wire, not welded wire, and put that up against the side, stuff some hay in it, you've got a manger. Goats naturally want to eat up off the ground. That's why they are not as suited to fighting infestation from parasites as sheep are. Sheep are constantly being exposed to worms. Goats, because they want to eat grass because goats want to eat leaves and brush, They don't get those worms. When you feed on the ground, you're introducing worms. Okay? So, what else do you need to think about? You've got your food as far as your hay, manger wise. Do you feed your grain in a manger or what do you feed? I actually use rubber buckets, Vortex buckets. They're very flexible, they're almost indestructible. They're a little bit trickier to clean out when they get used, but you can do it and they last a long, long time. You can use a manger, that's fine. I recommend when you're setting up your mangers though, you either use a keyhole, which means a round thing at the top and then it comes down so they put their head in and slide down, or make sure that the openings are wide enough for them to get a head in, their nose in, but not their head in, because other goat will come in and slam them and then you can have a broken neck. So keep that in mind when you're figuring out how to feed. You have to look at goat behavior. If you've got a really dominant one, make sure that there's a second feeder for a shyer goat to get, or a big enough feeder that this dominant one's not going to slam them out. Those are some of the things we have to worry about. Other people actually put benches in their pens, in their houses. I would love to be able to do that. I would need to have a huge house in order to do that. But goats love to climb, so giving them exercise, giving them platforms to lay down on, keeps them healthier, keeps them drier, keeps them happier. So if you've only got a few pet goats, go for it. It's easy enough to clean them off. They don't foul them as much as they would the ground. Okay? So the other issue we have is, do you lock them in at night or not? What do you use for a latch? Okay, I may have told you about Mudslide, my amazing goat that learned how to do a goat-proof latch. I recommend actually using not so much a goat latch, but a horse latch where you actually have to lift it up, slide it over, and then slide it back down. Those are heavy duty. A goat really can't do that. Or you can use just a piece of cut 2x4, slide it over, but then peg it into place. Because if the goat can get their nose in there, they'll flip it out over. Okay? Just a couple more things before we go for this episode. I'm assuming since you're taking this class that you're just thinking about having some pets and probably not keeping bucks. If you are thinking about getting a buck down the road, don't plan on keeping the bucks with the does. Their smell will taint the milk. They can be rough on the kids, and mom won't be happy if there's a buck trying to breed her doelings. So bucks do not make good pets. Stick to does and wethers. When it comes to housing, I mentioned earlier about Rubbermaid sheds or plastic sheds and drilling holes. If you're going to build your own shed, most people think about using pressure-treated lumber when they're building outside. If you're going to use pressure-treated lumber, you need to encase it in something. You might want to sister it up against a simple 1/4-inch plank or a 1/4-inch plywood, but the goats will nibble and chaw at the wood, and you don't want them to eat the chemicals that are in the pressure-treated lumber. Keep the area where they can reach with their mouths protected away from keeping them away from the chemicals. Okay? So that's it for Is Cute Enough housing section. I'll be back in the next class to talk about fencing. Okay? Bye.